My name is Marty Meierotto, and I work for the Alaska Fire Service, part of the BLM.
For 30 years, America watched a man on television without understanding the sacrifice beneath the surface. Marty Meierotto, a bush pilot and wilderness legend, lived two completely separate lives in cycles that tested his body, mind, and family. Behind the cameras and frozen landscapes was a pattern of calculated risks, isolation, and physical danger that few could endure. No one suspected the true cost until the pieces finally came together. The full truth about Marty Meierotto's double life will be revealed in this video. Marty Meierotto was born around 1960 in northern Wisconsin. His father, Thomas T. Meierotto, made his living as a trapper in the dense forests of America's northern frontier. His mother, Karen Meierotto, raised Marty alongside his brothers Jeff and Steve in a home where survival skills mattered more than formal education. The family lived simply, bound to the land and the seasonal rhythms of wildlife. When Marty was just 7 years old, his father took him into the woods for the first time. In the late 60s, northern Wisconsin still held vast stretches of wilderness where a man could set trap lines without seeing another person for days. Thomas taught his son to read animal tracks in fresh snow, set steel traps without losing fingers to the cold, and check lines before dawn. These mornings started in darkness, with temperatures that turned breath to ice. Marty learned early that hesitation meant frostbite, and mistakes meant empty traps. By age 8, Marty could skin a marten faster than most grown men. His small hands worked the blade while his father watched in silence, correcting only when necessary. The boy understood that fur quality determined whether the family ate well that month or stretched food thin. There was no room for waste. Every pelt had to be perfect, stretched on boards and dried without tears or knife marks. His father once said, "A trapper who ruins fur doesn't eat." That lesson stayed with Marty for life. Through his teenage years in the 1970s, Marty continued running trap lines with his father and brothers. School took a back seat to the work that fed the family. Teachers noticed his absences but said nothing. In rural Wisconsin, trapping families were left alone to manage their own survival. After graduating high school, Marty skipped college entirely and worked odd jobs between trapping seasons. He cut timber in logging camps, earning just enough to buy supplies for the next winter. The pay was low, the work brutal, and the hours long. Logging camps in northern Wisconsin operated in conditions that would shut down modern operations. Men worked in sub-zero cold, handling chainsaws without proper safety equipment, felling trees that could crush them in seconds if the wind shifted wrong. Between logging seasons, Marty returned to the trap line, but the family trapping business struggled against increasing competition and declining fur prices. Throughout the late 70s and early 80s, fur markets collapsed as fashion trends shifted and animal rights movements gained momentum. Marten pelts that once brought good money now sold for half their former value. More trappers competed for fewer animals across shrinking territories. The Meierotto family found themselves working harder for less return. More trappers meant smaller territories, and smaller territories meant fewer animals. Trap lines that had supported families for generations could no longer produce enough fur to cover basic expenses. By the early 80s, northern Wisconsin could no longer support a young man trying to make a living from fur alone. Marty watched other trappers his age abandon the lifestyle, moving to cities for factory work or construction jobs, but he refused to follow them. He had a plan of his own, and that plan, you'll see, away from home. In 1985, everything changed. Marty and his brother Jeff decided to leave Wisconsin and head north to Alaska, planning a short stay to scout better trapping opportunities. They had heard stories from other trappers about Alaska's vast wilderness, untouched territories where fur-bearing animals still thrived in numbers Wisconsin had not seen in decades. The decision was not romantic, it was economic survival. They arrived in Fairbanks with minimal money and no connections. Alaska in the mid-80s offered wilderness but no guarantees. The state was full of men who had come north with dreams of living off the land, only to discover that Alaska broke those who were not prepared. Marty took whatever work he could find. First as a janitor in Fairbanks, cleaning office buildings at night for minimum wage. Then in construction, hauling materials on job sites during the short summer building season. Then back to logging, working in remote camps where conditions made Wisconsin logging look safe. He lived in tents during the warmest months and rough cabins when temperatures dropped. Every dollar he earned went into a fund for his first real trap line in Alaska's interior. He ate cheap food, wore worn-out clothes, and saved relentlessly. Other workers spent their paychecks on beer and entertainment in Fairbanks. Marty spent nothing. His goal was singular: get enough money to buy trapping supplies, find remote territory, and establish a line where he could work without competition. The landscape was different from anything he had known. Instead of the dense hardwood forests of Wisconsin, Alaska stretched endless and open, with mountains that disappeared into clouds and rivers that ran cold and fast year-round. The scale was overwhelming. Wisconsin trap lines covered miles. Alaska trap lines covered hundreds of miles. The winters dropped to 40 below zero or colder, temperatures that made Wisconsin winters look mild. At 40 below, exposed skin froze in under a minute. Metal became brittle and snapped. Rubber seals cracked. Batteries died. Equipment that worked fine in moderate cold failed completely in extreme cold. Marty realized immediately that Alaska demanded a different level of commitment. The margin for error was smaller. Mistakes that would be inconvenient in Wisconsin were fatal in Alaska. Getting lost in Wisconsin meant an uncomfortable night in the woods. Getting lost in Alaska meant death from exposure. Running out of supplies in Wisconsin meant a trip to town. Running out of supplies in Alaska meant starvation because there was no town within reach. While others came for summer work and left before the freeze, Marty saw opportunity in the harshness. The difficulty kept competition low. Men who could not handle the conditions quit and went home. Those who stayed had access to territories that would never work in the lower states. He decided to stay permanently and build a life around the one thing he knew: trapping. But first he had to learn Alaska's specific challenges. The animals were similar to Wisconsin species but behaved differently in the vast landscape. The techniques that worked in hardwood forests did not translate directly to boreal forests and tundra. He spent his first few seasons making mistakes, learning through failure what the land demanded. Traps froze solid in extreme cold and required different handling. Snow conditions varied wildly, requiring different approaches to travel. Wildlife patterns shifted with the severe seasons in ways Wisconsin animals never did. Around 1988, Marty developed the pattern that would define the next 30 years of his life. He needed income to fund his trapping, and trapping alone would not cover the costs of running remote lines in Alaska. The solution came in the form of a summer job with the Bureau of Land Management's Alaska Fire Service. Marty trained as a wildland firefighter, learning to dig fire breaks, operate pumps, and survive in smoke-filled forests where visibility dropped to zero and temperatures reached extreme highs. The training was intense but straightforward. Follow orders, work until exhaustion, do not quit. He then advanced to smoke jumper, one of the most dangerous jobs in wildland firefighting. Smoke jumpers parachuted into remote wildfires across the state, often landing in areas with no roads, no water sources, and no backup if things went wrong. The work required physical fitness that bordered on superhuman. Jumpers carried 100-pound packs, hiked for miles through rough terrain, dug fire lines for 16 hours straight, and slept on the ground with minimal gear. Injuries were common: broken bones from bad landings, burns from shifting winds, smoke inhalation that damaged lungs. Some jumpers died, parachutes failed, winds changed suddenly and trapped crews in fire. Trees fell on men working below. But the work paid well enough to support a winter on the trap line, and that made it worth the risk. The work was dangerous, physical, and paid well enough to support a winter on the trap line. A single summer season could earn what most Alaskans made in half a year, but it also meant living in two completely different worlds. The contrast between summer and winter work could not have been more extreme. Summer meant constant human contact, radio communications, helicopters overhead, base camps with dozens of personnel. Winter meant the opposite: absolute isolation, no radio contact for weeks, self-reliance pushed to its limit. In summer, Marty fought fires. When the first snows fell and fire season ended, he transitioned immediately into his second life. The contrast could not have been sharper. Summer meant teams, radios, and constant human contact. Winter meant absolute isolation. What came next would test whether any man could sustain such extreme opposites year after year without breaking. The trap line. Marty's trap line stretched along the Dranjik River in one of the most remote corners of Alaska. Getting there required a bush plane, and Marty learned to fly out of necessity, not passion. He bought a Piper Super Cub, a small high-wing aircraft built for rough country. The plane became his lifeline, the only way in or out of the wilderness during winter months. He taught himself to land on frozen rivers, navigate through mountain passes in whiteout conditions, and troubleshoot mechanical problems in sub-zero temperatures. Flying was not romantic, it was survival. The cabins Marty built along his trapline were simple structures, logs chinked with moss and heated by wood stoves. He hauled supplies in by plane each fall: rice, flour, coffee, ammunition, traps, fuel for his chainsaw and snowmobile. Once the rivers froze solid and snow buried the landscape, there was no resupply until spring. If he ran out of food, he hunted. If equipment broke, he fixed it with whatever materials he had. There were no second chances. Every day on the trapline followed the same brutal routine. Marty woke before dawn, often around 4 a.m., when darkness still covered the landscape and temperatures reached their coldest point. He started a fire to warm the cabin enough to move without pain, feeding split wood into the stove until the space became barely tolerable. Even then, frost coated the inside walls. Water buckets froze solid overnight and had to be thawed before he could drink. His breath hung in clouds inside the cabin. He geared up in layers: long underwear, wool pants, insulated bibs, multiple shirts, a heavy parka, boots rated for 60 below, gloves that allowed enough dexterity to handle traps but kept fingers from freezing. Then he headed out into temperatures that could freeze exposed skin in minutes. The sun, when it rose at all during the darkest months, barely cleared the horizon before dropping again. He ran his trapline on foot or by snowmobile, checking dozens of sets scattered across miles of river and forest. Traps had to be checked daily, or animals froze solid in the steel and became worthless. A marten caught in a trap would freeze within hours at 40 below. The fur remained good, but the animal became a block of ice that had to be thawed before skinning. The work was repetitive, cold, and exhausting. Each set required the same inspection. Approach carefully to avoid scaring nearby animals. Check the trap for catches. Reset if empty, moving the location slightly if the set was not producing. Rebait with fish or meat. Brush away tracks to make the set look natural again. If an animal was caught, dispatch it humanely, reset the trap, and move to the next set. Miles between sets meant hours on the snowmobile or walking through deep snow when the machine broke down. By late afternoon, Marty returned to the cabin with whatever he had caught in his pack. Then came the skinning. Each pelt had to be handled carefully. A single knife slip could ruin a week's worth of work. The fur was stretched on boards to dry, stored in the cabin where it would not freeze or rot. After skinning came cooking a simple meal: rice, beans, whatever meat he had hunted. Then he collapsed into sleep, knowing he would wake in a few hours and repeat the entire process. The routine never varied. There were no days off, no breaks, no excuses for skipping the line. Traps had to be checked every day, no matter the weather, no matter how he felt. The isolation was total. Weeks passed without seeing another human being. Marty spoke to no one, heard no voices except his own, and faced every problem alone. Snowmobiles broke down miles from the cabin, leaving him to walk home through deep snow in the dark. Chainsaws seized up when he needed firewood most. The Super Cub's engine coughed and sputtered in cold starts, and every flight carried the risk of going down in a country where no one would find him for months. He once said, "Out here, you fix it yourself or you freeze." That was not a figure of speech. Wildlife added another layer of danger. Wolves followed his trapline, sometimes tearing apart animals before he could retrieve them. Moose charged him on narrow trails where there was nowhere to run. Grizzly bears, though rare in winter, occasionally emerged from dens and could kill a man in seconds. Marty carried a rifle everywhere, not for sport, but because the wilderness did not forgive mistakes. But the greatest challenge was not physical. It was mental. The human mind struggles with prolonged isolation, and Marty spent entire winters without meaningful conversation. The silence became oppressive. In a city, silence is rare and brief. In the wilderness, silence is total and endless. No traffic sounds, no voices, no music unless he brought a radio, and reception was non-existent in the mountains. Just wind, the occasional crack of trees splitting in the cold, and the sound of his own breathing. After weeks alone, that silence began to feel like a physical weight pressing down. Some men broke under it. They started talking to themselves in ways that went beyond normal muttering. They made irrational decisions, forgot basic safety procedures, or simply gave up and radioed for rescue. Marty developed routines to stay sane. He talked aloud to himself while working, narrating each action to keep his mind engaged. He kept a journal, writing down daily events even when nothing significant happened. The act of writing forced his brain to process and organize thoughts, preventing the mental fog that came with isolation. He maintained strict daily schedules even when there was no reason to hurry. Wake at the same time, check traps in the same order, eat at the same hour, sleep at a consistent time. The routine created structure in a place where days could blur together into an undifferentiated stretch of cold and dark. The alternative was letting time become shapeless, and that led to dangerous mistakes. Men who lost mental discipline in the bush made fatal errors. They forgot to check the weather before flights. They misjudged ice thickness and fell through frozen rivers. They failed to maintain equipment and ended up stranded. Marty had seen it happen to others, heard stories of trappers found dead in their cabins, their bodies frozen, their journals revealing a slow descent into confusion and poor judgment. He knew that staying sharp meant staying alive. The wilderness did not care about his mental state. It would kill him just as easily whether he was thinking clearly or spiraling into isolation madness. So he forced himself to maintain discipline, to follow routines, to keep his mind engaged even when every part of him wanted to shut down and drift. But he didn't need to shut down and drift because something interesting happened to him. Trapping love. In the 90s, Marty met Dominique, a woman who understood Alaska's demands in ways few could. She had grown up in the state and knew what winter meant in the interior. She understood that men who lived on trap lines were different from men in cities. They were harder, quieter, more comfortable with isolation. The life attracted a specific type of personality, and Dominique recognized that Marty fit the pattern completely. They married and settled in Two Rivers, a small community outside Fairbanks where winter temperatures regularly dropped below zero and summer brought constant daylight. Dominique became the anchor that allowed Marty to continue his dual life. While he disappeared into the wilderness each winter, she managed their home, handled logistics, and kept the household running. She paid bills, maintained the property, dealt with repairs, and managed everything that required consistent presence. She waited for the satellite phone calls that came once a week if weather allowed, brief conversations that confirmed he was alive and safe. The calls were rarely long. Satellite phone time was expensive, battery power was limited, and there was little to say beyond the basics. Food supplies adequate, equipment functioning, no injuries, weather holding. She knew the risks intimately. She knew that every winter brought a real chance he would not come back. Bush planes crashed, trappers fell through ice. Equipment failures stranded men in conditions that killed within hours. She had heard the stories, knew other women who had lost husbands to the wilderness. But she also knew that trapping was not something Marty chose to do as a hobby or career. It was who he was at his core. Asking him to stop would be like asking him to stop breathing. She accepted the life because she loved him, but acceptance did not make it easy. The worry was constant, the loneliness real, and the burden of managing everything alone was heavy. Around 2005 or 2006, their daughter Noah Jane was born. Marty now had a family that depended on him, but he did not slow down. If anything, the pressure increased. He needed the income from both jobs to support a wife and child in Alaska, where the cost of living ran high and there were no safety nets. Summer firefighting paid the bills and funded the trap line. Winter trapping provided furs that sold for enough to keep the cycle going. Missing either season meant financial collapse. Marty kept this pattern running for decades, never stopping, never resting. By the time Noah was old enough to understand, her father was gone more than half the year. She grew up knowing her father as a man who existed in two separate worlds, and she saw him fully in neither. But the wilderness was about to demand an even higher price, and the cameras that would soon follow him would reveal just how close to the edge he truly lived. Under the spotlight. In 2012, everything shifted again. The History Channel launched a reality series called Mountain Men, profiling Americans still living off the land in remote corners of the country. Producers contacted Marty and asked if they could film his trapping season. He agreed, not because he wanted fame, but because the show paid. The money helped fund Noah's future and reduce the financial pressure that had driven him for years. Mountain Men premiered on May 31, 2012, and Marty became a central figure. Audiences saw him flying his Super Cub through mountain passes, setting trap lines in brutal cold, and surviving alone in conditions that looked impossible. The show portrayed him as a wilderness expert, a throwback to an earlier time when men lived by skill instead of convenience. What viewers did not see was the grinding exhaustion behind the scenes, the constant worry about equipment failure, and the toll that isolation took on his mind and marriage. The cameras captured moments, but they could not convey the weight of living that life year after year. During the show's early seasons, Marty faced incidents that revealed how close he operated to the edge. In 2013, a writer named Bill Heavey visited Marty's trap line to report on his lifestyle. Heavey got lost in the wilderness and began showing signs of hypothermia. Marty found him, brought him back to the cabin, warmed him up, and likely saved his life. The incident made news, but for Marty, it was just another day in the bush where mistakes killed and preparedness mattered. The following year brought Marty's closest call. During the filming of Season 3, Marty was flying his Super Cub low over the trapline, checking sets from the air to save time. It was a routine flight, one he had made hundreds of times before. The weather was clear, the engine sounded normal, and he saw no reason for concern. Without warning, the plane went into a sharp nosedive. One moment he was level at 200 feet. The next, the nose dropped and the ground rushed up. The controls fought him as he pulled back, trying to regain altitude. His mind went through the emergency checklist, even as adrenaline flooded his system. Throttle, stick, trim. Nothing responded correctly. For seconds that felt like minutes. The frozen ground rushed up toward the windshield. He could see individual trees, rocks on the river bar, details that should not be visible from the air. The altimeter spun downward. 150 feet, 100 feet, 50 feet. His hands fought the stick with everything he had. Marty finally wrestled the plane level just above the treetops, close enough that branches scraped the underside of the fuselage. His heart hammered so hard he could hear it over the engine. He managed to land on a narrow river bar, the skis touching down hard enough to bounce the plane twice before it settled. He sat in the cockpit for a full minute, hands shaking before he could move. He was alive, but stranded overnight without his full survival gear. The emergency kit in the plane held minimal supplies, a lighter, some emergency rations, a small tarp, but no sleeping bag, no tent, no proper cold weather gear. He had not planned to be on the ground. The temperature dropped below zero as the sun set. He had no tent, no sleeping bag, and limited food. The cold came fast in November. Within an hour of landing, the temperature had fallen to 20 below and was still dropping. Marty knew he could not survive the night in the plane without heat. The small aircraft offered no insulation. Sitting still in those temperatures would lead to hypothermia within hours. He needed calories and he needed to stay moving. He grabbed his rifle from the plane and went hunting. It took an hour of walking the river bar before he spotted a snowshoe hare. One shot and he had food. He field dressed the animal, built a small fire using deadfall from the riverbank, and cooked the meat. The food provided enough calories to keep his core temperature stable. He spent the night in the plane doing push-ups, squats, and other exercises to generate body heat. Every time he felt drowsiness creeping in, he forced himself to move. Sleep in those conditions meant not waking up. He knew that if the cold disabled him, no one would find his body until spring. The trap line was too remote. No one knew exactly where he was. The radio in the plane could not reach anyone. He was completely alone with a disabled aircraft and falling temperatures. He made it through by sheer determination and the knowledge that giving in meant death. When the sun rose, he inspected the plane, found the mechanical issue, made a field repair with tools from the emergency kit, and flew out. The incident shook him. He had been flying for years, and it was the first time the plane nearly killed him. But he told no one how close it had been. On camera, he downplayed the danger. In reality, he had been within seconds of impact and within hours of freezing to death on the ground. The show continued, and Marty appeared in seasons 1 through 8, becoming one of the most recognized faces on Mountain Men. But the pressure mounted. Filming added a new layer of complexity to an already difficult life. Marty had to coordinate with camera crews, repeat actions for better shots, and manage the logistics of getting film equipment into and out of the wilderness. The work that had been private and solitary was now public and staged. He still ran his trap line, still fought fires in summer, and still flew his plane in dangerous conditions, but now he did it under the scrutiny of millions of viewers. Behind the public success, Marty struggled with what the show cost him. Noah was growing up, and he was missing it. Every winter he spent on the trap line was time away from his daughter. Her first steps, her first words, her early school years, all happened while he was hundreds of miles away in the wilderness. Every summer, fighting fires took him away from home when she needed him most. Dominique held everything together, managing the household alone, attending parent-teacher conferences alone, handling the daily challenges of raising a child while her husband lived in two separate worlds. The strain on the marriage was real. Relationships require presence, and Marty was absent more than half the year. Phone calls from the trap line came once a week if satellite coverage allowed, and they were brief. Battery power was limited. The conversations covered logistics, supplies needed, health status, whether he was safe. There was no time for deep connection, no space for the small daily moments that build intimacy. Dominique understood the life she had married into, but understanding did not make it easier. She watched Noah grow up asking when her father would come home, and watched her daughter learn to expect absence instead of presence. Marty saw it too. During the brief periods he was home between fire season and trapping season, he noticed how much Noah had changed. She was taller. Her interests had shifted. She had new friends he had never met. Conversations felt awkward, as if he were trying to connect with someone he barely knew. The guilt grew heavier each year. He was providing for his family financially, but he was failing them in every other way that mattered. The realization came slowly, building over years until it could no longer be ignored. Then everything he had built started to crack. A decision was coming that would force him to choose between the life he had always known and the family he was losing. The breaking point. In 2019, Marty made a decision that surprised fans of the show. He announced his retirement from Mountain Men after season 8. The reason was simple. Noah was entering her teenage years, and Marty wanted to teach her the skills he knew before it was too late. He could not do that while cameras followed him around the wilderness. He wanted private, one-on-one time with his daughter, passing on the trapping knowledge his father had given him. The show had served its purpose, providing income and exposure, but it was time to step back. That same year, Marty also retired from the BLM Alaska Fire Service after 31 years. He had spent 3 decades jumping into wildfires, and his body finally demanded rest. The double life that had sustained him financially was no longer necessary. Noah was older, the family was stable, and Marty could afford to slow down. For the first time since 1988, he did not face the summer-to-winter cycle that had consumed his life. In 2020, Marty published a book titled In the Land of Wilderness, The Writings of Marty Meierotto. The book collected stories from his years in Alaska, describing close calls, equipment failures, wildlife encounters, and the long stretches of isolation. It was not a memoir in the traditional sense. Marty did not reflect on his feelings or analyze his choices. Instead, he documented what happened, how he responded, and what he learned. The writing was direct, practical, and free of drama. Readers got a window into a life few could imagine living, told by a man who did not romanticize hardship. Despite retiring from the show, Marty did not disappear. He returned occasionally as a guest in later seasons, including seasons 12 and 13. These appearances were brief and on his terms, showing viewers that he was still active in the wilderness but no longer bound to the filming schedule. He continued trapping in winter, though with shorter seasons and less intensity. He still flew his Super Cub, maintaining the plane himself and landing on frozen rivers when necessary. The skills did not fade, but the relentless pace was gone. Marty focused on Noah, teaching her to shoot precision rifles in competitive settings and introducing her to aviation. She learned to fly, just as he had, because in Alaska, knowing how to operate a plane was as essential as knowing how to drive. Marty took her up in the Super Cub, teaching her the basics of flight, how to read instruments, how to feel the aircraft respond to controls, how to land on rough terrain. She showed natural talent, the same instinct for reading conditions that Marty had developed over decades. He watched her progress with quiet pride, seeing in her the same discipline and focus his father had instilled in him. Marty passed on trapping skills as well, taking her out on the line and showing her how to read signs, set traps, and handle furs. These lessons happened in private, away from cameras, in the same way his father had taught him. He showed her how to identify tracks in snow, how to determine where animals traveled, how to place traps in locations where animals would encounter them naturally. He taught her to skin furs without damaging the pelt, to stretch them properly, to judge quality. The knowledge that had sustained his family for generations now moved to the next. Noah learned not because she needed the skills to survive economically, but because they connected her to a lineage that stretched back through her father, her grandfather, and beyond. The work was different now. Marty no longer ran trap lines out of necessity. He ran them because they defined who he was. The money from furs did not matter anymore. What mattered was the connection to the land, the annual rhythm of seasons, the physical challenge of operating in conditions that killed weaker men. He was in his 60s now, and his body felt the accumulated damage of decades in the cold. His knees ached from years of walking miles through deep snow. His hands showed the scars of a lifetime working with steel traps and sharp knives. His back protested from the constant bending and lifting required to check trap lines. But he pushed through the pain because stopping felt like surrender. The new backcountry cabin he built became a project that consumed him. He flew materials into the remote location piece by piece: logs, roofing materials, windows, a wood stove. Each flight was a calculated risk, loading the Super Cub to capacity and threading through mountain passes. The construction happened over months, with Marty working alone to notch logs, raise walls, and build a roof that would hold under the weight of winter snow. The cabin was not elaborate. One room, a sleeping loft, a wood stove for heat, functional and simple, like everything else in his life. When finished, it stood as a monument to self-reliance, built entirely by hand in a place where most people would never venture. Most would have stopped completely. Most would have walked away from the wilderness and settled into comfortable retirement. But what happened next revealed the truth about why Marty could never fully leave. The answer lay in the lesson his father had taught him at age 7, and it would define the final chapter of his story. Still standing? By 2024 and into 2025, Marty continued living in Two Rivers with Dominique and Noah, who had reached adulthood. He built a new backcountry cabin, a project that required flying materials into remote locations and constructing the structure by hand. The work was familiar and grounding. It connected him to the land in a way that nothing else could. He trapped when he wanted to, flew when conditions allowed, and spent time with family without the pressure of deadlines or cameras. Marty's life had been defined by resilience under conditions most people would never face. There were no scandals, no controversies, and no hidden secrets beyond the ones inherent in a life split between two worlds. He had lived a genuine double life, but it was not about deception. It was about necessity. Summer work funded winter trapping, and winter trapping fed a need that went deeper than money. The wilderness was where Marty felt most himself, even when it tried to kill him. The struggles were real. Equipment failures in sub-zero temperatures, plane incidents that nearly ended in crashes, weeks of isolation that tested his sanity, financial pressure to keep earning in two demanding jobs, and the constant awareness that a single mistake could leave him dead in a place where no one would find his body. He faced those struggles not because he sought danger, but because the life he chose demanded it. The alternative was giving up the trap line, leaving Alaska, and becoming something he was not. People who watched mountain men saw a man living an adventurous life in the beautiful wilderness. What they did not see was the cost. The marriages that failed under the strain of isolation. The children who grew up without their fathers present for birthdays, holidays, school events. The women who raised families alone while their husbands disappeared into the bush for months. The men who went into the wilderness and never came out, their bodies found years later or never found at all. Alaska's remoteness swallowed people who made small mistakes. A broken leg miles from help. A fire that consumed a cabin while the occupants slept. Ice that gave way under a snowmobile, plunging man and machine into freezing water. Marty survived because he prepared for failure, planned for disaster, and never assumed the wilderness owed him anything. When the snowmobile broke down 20 miles from the cabin, he walked home through waist-deep snow, arriving exhausted but alive. When the plane engine sputtered, he landed early rather than pushing for home, spending uncomfortable nights on river bars but avoiding crashes. When animals tore apart his traps and ruined sets, he rebuilt them without anger or frustration. The work never stopped. There was always another trap to check, another piece of equipment to repair, another challenge to overcome. The loneliness was real and constant. Even with Dominique and Noah, even with occasional visits from friends, Marty spent most of his adult life alone. The isolation shaped him in ways that could not be undone. He became comfortable with silence. He preferred his own company to crowds. Social gatherings felt awkward and draining. The wilderness had remade him into someone who functioned best when alone, and that came with a price. Relationships suffered. Friendships faded. The connections that sustained most people felt thin and unnecessary to a man who had spent winters without seeing another human face. But the alternative was unthinkable. Giving up the trap line meant giving up the core of his identity. Marty was a trapper before he was a husband, a father, a television personality, or anything else. The wilderness was not something he visited. It was where he belonged. The cold, the isolation, the constant danger, all of it felt more real than the comfortable modern world most people inhabited. He chose hardship over comfort because comfort felt like slow death, a gradual surrender to weakness. Even in retirement, Marty continued operating in the margins where most people would never go. He lived in a place where winter temperatures regularly hit 40 below, where a wrong turn could mean death, and where self-reliance was not a philosophy but a daily requirement. The life he built was not for everyone. It demanded physical toughness, mental endurance, and a willingness to accept risk as normal. Marty had all three, and it kept him alive for decades in a landscape that killed weaker men. The public life and the private life had finally merged into one. Marty no longer split his year between firefighting and trapping, and he no longer worked for cameras. He simply lived on his terms in the place he had chosen 40 years earlier. The double life was over, not because he walked away, but because he had earned the right to live a single, integrated life rooted in the wilderness he loved. Marty Meierotto spent 30 years living two separate existences, each demanding total commitment, and he never broke. The toll was real. The risks were constant. The isolation was crushing. But the man who emerged from those decades was someone who knew exactly who he was and what he was capable of. The wilderness tested him in every way possible, and he passed every test by refusing to quit, even when quitting would have been easier, safer, and more rational. At the end of 2025, Marty remained active in the Alaskan bush, still trapping, still flying, still building. The life he lived was one of calculated risks and relentless discipline, shaped by a father who taught him that survival was not about luck. It was about preparation, skill, and the willingness to face consequences without complaining. That lesson, learned at age 7 in the forests of northern Wisconsin, carried Marty through 3 decades of fire and ice, and it still carries him today. After 40 years in Alaska, the two worlds Marty once inhabited no longer stood apart. They blended into one, shaping the portrait of a man who refused to compromise, even when the cost was isolation, danger, and years away from the people he loved. The wilderness demanded everything, and Marty gave it, knowing that anything less meant failure. And failure, in the places Marty lived and worked, meant death. If you believe that true resilience comes from facing impossible conditions without backing down, share this video so others can discover the journey of Marty Meierotto, the man who lived 2 lives so he could stay true to one calling. What do you think of Marty? Tell us what you think as you like this video and subscribe to the channel. Turn on notifications so you don't miss the next stories about the people who choose hardship over comfort and survive on skill alone.